In our last lesson, we discussed the French Revolution, and we looked at it very generally as a basis and context for understanding the idea of nationalism. We discussed the fact that the French Revolution was a pivotal event in the development of French nationalism. And so now let's take some time and actually go through the revolution, its events, struggles, and figures in more particular detail. So in this current lesson, we're going to look at French nationalism, but we're going to look at the French Revolution more specifically, and we're going to look at the causes and phases of the French Revolution. And again, when we do so, we will do so within the context of the first unit, the whole idea of the important concepts of nation and identity, and of course of the important related issue, to what extent should nation be the foundation of identity. So let's look at the objective for the current lesson. By the end of this current lesson, you should be able to determine the causes leading up to the French Revolution and understand the basic phases that the revolution went through. So what were some of the causes that led to the French Revolution, or causes leading up to the beginning of the revolution? Well, in the 18th century, in the 1700s, there was a movement, an intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. And basically the Enlightenment was a philosophical tradition and movement that basically ridiculed superstition and encouraged the use of reason and logic in day-to-day lives. And within the Enlightenment, such ideas of liberty and equality for all men came about, and this had important underpinnings for the French Revolution. Also, during the year previous to the French Revolution in the late 1780s, there was an economic crisis. France, the government of France, had gone into debt, and at the same time, because of long winters and a severe drought the previous summer, famine spread throughout France during that period of time, and unfortunately, and due in large part to trade and poor agricultural harvests, famine spread and economic crises continued, and there was even downturns in manufacturing and in trade within France. And all of this had a negative impact on France and caused great suffering for the French people. And so this became an important event that basically sparked the French Revolution. I did mention the fact that the French government was in debt. They had to pay for wars that they'd been involved in the prior decade. France spent enormous sums of money assisting the United States and the 13 original colonies in revolting against Great Britain. That and other expenses that the king entailed on the nobility, particularly as regards to their lifestyles, put the government into severe debt. So let's begin with the French government prior to the outbreak of revolution, and this was known as the old regime, or ancien regime in French, and let's get an understanding of what that regime was actually like. The old regime was basically the social and political system that was put in place, and it existed in most of Europe during the 1700s. If you recall the map that we had showed in a previous lesson, we saw all of Western Europe basically being empires, kingdoms, or principalities. And these countries were ruled by what was known as absolutism. In other words, there was a monarch, whether it was a prince or a king or an emperor, and they had absolute control over the government. And classes of people were basically divided into two groups: the privileged classes that had all the rights and privileges, and the unprivileged class, which had basically no rights and basically felt all the burdens of taxation and other economic and social burdens that the privileged class did not face. The unprivileged people, for example, paid taxes in great number. They were treated badly by the government. Their interests were not considered or looked after at all. And the privileged people, basically the nobility of these various states in Western Europe, paid no taxes and were treated very well by the government. So let's look at the society under the old regime, specifically in France, to see exactly what the makeup of the society was and how it impacted and eventually led to the French Revolution. Well, in France, the country was basically the society of France. The people were divided into what were known as three estates or formal classes. The first estate was made up of the high-ranking elements of the Catholic Church, and it was known as the First Estate, and it was a privileged class. The high-ranking members of the church did not pay taxes and were treated quite well and represented quite specifically by the government of France at the time. The Second Estate, the formal class within French society, was made up of the nobility or the aristocracy. And the Second Estate was also a privileged class, paid no taxes, and was represented, their interests were represented quite clearly by the French government. The Third Estate was made up of everyone else, peasants, merchants in the cities, all of these people who were not either high-ranking officials of the church or members of the nobility. All of these people made up the Third Estate, and of course this estate was not privileged, and they ended up facing most of the burdens of taxation. Their interests were not clearly represented by the French government. So what we see is quite a clear division within French society at the time, with the first two estates, that of the church and of the nobility, having all of the privileges, and the Third Estate having all of the burdens within the country. Here's in this chart of the three estates, what we see is basically an estimate of the population at the time, and we see exemptions, things that they were not forced to follow through with, and we look at the actual burdens that they had. So let's look at the First Estate. And again, that First Estate would be made up of the individuals of high-ranking members of the church. And when we look at these high-ranking clergy, we see of the total population of the time, they made up about 130,000 people. Now let's look at some of their privileges. They collected a tithe, which was money from the average citizen to help pay for costs that the church incurred. They had the ability to censor the press. They controlled education. They kept all important records such as birth, deaths, marriages. They made sure that the Catholic faith, even though not all French people were Catholic, was held in honor and kept in most important positions within the state. And they made sure that the monarch and nobility were Catholic in religion. And quite an astounding fact that for only 130,000 people, they owned about 20% of the land. Now let's look at some of their exemptions. They paid no taxes, and they were only subject to church law. In fact, they weren't even subject to the civil law of the country. How about burdens? Well, they had a moral obligation. They had no legal obligation, so they did in fact assist the poor and needy at times, and they always tended to support the monarchy in the old regime. Let's go look over at the Second Estate, that made up of the nobility, and they were even less, approximately 110,000 people. And let's look at some of their privileges. Well, they collected taxes in the form of feudal dues, so all individuals who were not part of the First or Second Estate had feudal dues that they had to pay, and the nobility of the Second Estate, were exempt from this. They monopolized military and state appointments, so high government positions in the military and in the state came strictly from the noble or Second Estate. And they, along with the First Estate, owned approximately 20% of the land. And as far as exemptions, they paid no taxes. And of course, their only burden was to support the monarchy in the old regime, which obviously they would do since they were benefiting a great deal from that regime. Let's now consider the Third Estate. And let's look at its population. Estimated population at the time of 25 million people. And they were everyone else. So they were artisans or middle class, merchants, peasants, city workers, even parish priests to some extent made up the bulk of the population. And let's look at their privileges. They had none, and they had no exemptions. They paid all the taxes. On top of the taxes to the state, they paid taxes to the church. They had to pay for taxes on goods brought into the city. They were forced to pay for road work in the form of taxes. There was a poll tax, so for their own individual existence, they had to pay a tax. They paid an income tax on the money they made. Anytime they bought salt, they had to pay a tax on salt. There was a property tax that they had to pay. And on top of all of these taxes, they also had to pay feudal dues to the local nobility. And so we see this sharp division between the classes in French society at the time in the 1700s, and we see that the majority of the population, some 25 million people, had no privileges, had all of the tax burdens, and were exempt from nothing. So let's look at the government under this old regime. What was it actually like? It was a monarchy, and the monarch, a king of France, ruled by divine right. And what that meant was that according to the monarch and the understanding of the people of the time, the king was king because God said he could be king, and he ruled as a result of God's desire for him to be king. And so there was to be no questioning of the monarchy. In fact, it was seen to be blasphemous to actually question the monarch, because if you question the monarch, you are basically questioning God. So let's look at the king. He made all laws. So consider the difference between France at that time with the king as an absolute monarchy and Canada in our current time. And we see that unlike Canada, where we have a prime minister who does not make all laws, there's a legislature and there's a Supreme Court which actually consider the constitutionality of the laws. France at that time, the king made all laws, and they were not subject to anybody's review. He levied all taxes, so he put taxes into place, and he decided how much money the government would actually spend. He controlled the military, and he decided who would be put into positions of power within the military. He made all decisions regarding war and peace. All domestic policy within the country was shaped and applied by the king. He appointed all people, particularly those people who would collect taxes and carry out his laws. So he was quite influential, because those individuals who did collect taxes and carried out laws were actually able to become rich at the behest of the king's decisions, and when taxes were collected, always seemed to be able to keep a portion of the taxes for themselves. He controlled all justice by appointing judges. So where there were courts within France, the king made sure that all judges were appointed by himself, and so always ruled in the king's favor. And he could imprison anyone at any time for any reason. In other words, there were blank warrants. A king could decide that a particular citizen should be arrested, and that would take place. Can you imagine something like that taking place in Canada? It wouldn't be possible. And he appointed individuals known as intendants. These were basically petty tyrants, but they were representatives of king who governed on the king's behalf in the various regions, the 30 districts of France. And in ruling, they also became quite rich, but they made sure to follow through with the king's desires and policies. Here's a cartoon that depicts the ancient regime and the conditions of the time. And when we look, we see the first estate with the high clergy, and the second estate, the nobility, and we see them basically as a huge burden, a big rock basically on the chest of the third estate, the 25 million other French citizens who had absolutely no exemptions from taxation, and created the burdens for the majority of the French people. And so this cartoon really does symbolically picture the conditions of France during the time of the old or ancient regime. Let's consider now the economic conditions under the old regime, when we consider how sharp the contrast was between the three classes within society, and that the third class, which made up some 25 million or almost 90% of the population, what we consider is that it must have been the economic conditions for most of the people of France to be quite terrible. Well, at the time, France's economy was based primarily on agriculture. They did not have a revolution where there's a large degree of manufacturing based on machines that were created. Basically, peasant farmers of France uh, created most of the agricultural products, and they bore most of the burden of taxation.